Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. It is profiler time. We actually have our profiler working kind of neat right now, but it's still not super usable day to day at the moment because there's like at least two things that I think we still want to be able to do to make it easy for us to work on it. And that is, first of all, we want to have a way of like pausing things so that we can like stop what's going on and be able to use the profiler without it like jittering, because like it's updating every frame. And the other thing that we want to be able to do too, I think, is get a couple other views in there. Like right now we don't have a way of just saying what's the total time for any given frame spent in a particular routine, right? We don't do any summation stuff. So we do sort of the thread utilization view very well, but we don't do like just what's the total time spent in various routines. That we don't actually draw at the moment. So we kind of need to just do a little bit more of that stuff, and then I think we're pretty good shape on the profiling front. So let's take a look at what that is. Today is day 261, so day 260 source is what you want to start with if you're trying to follow along at home. Here is my project file. There it is. So here's the project file, and here is the currently running state of the profiler. The other thing is, let's make it to, I'm sick of it coming up tiny, because right now we initialize, like the width is just going to be initialized to 0 all the time, which is stupid, because we would never want that to actually be the case. So I feel like we should do a thing where inside the initial sort of look at a particular debug view, I think we should have a way of, where is it? A way of initializing it to something else. So here's the thread interval graph. When we get one of these dimension things back, I'm just going to do a thing that's like, you know, if view profile graph. You know what? I kind of want to pull that out into its own thing, actually. I think I want to do something where I can, like, grab one of these guys out of there, just so I don't have to keep typing the whole thing. So I can say, here's the graph. It's that. And then I can just do that. So then I can say if, do we have an has area kind of a thing? Well, I could also say if graph block.dim x equals 0. Oops. And graph block.dim y equals 0. Then I'm just going to assume that this is the first time that we've got it, and I'll make it, you know, bigger. So I don't know what I'll make it be. Let's say that it should probably be all the way across the screen for the most part, I would think. I don't know. And as far as how big it should be, maybe something like that. Because they probably want it to be relatively large. That'd be my guess anyway. What are you complaining about? That's supposed to be an address. Then you can have an address. You know? Calm yourself. All right. So now I'm hoping that when we run this, if I expand the profile, I'll get like, yeah, a default size of the profile that's actually more usable, right? So one of these profiles, I feel like I maybe want in the profile window, like I don't really think we've done much in the way of having any real buttons or anything. I feel like we kind of want some buttons in here as well, like some things to change the view style or something like that. Like that sort of thing. We want to get some of that in there too. But at least now when we open it, it's like a reasonable size, which is obviously better. So, and our drill down is working as well. Like we can drill down into something, like I said, but we can't go back. So a back button would be nice there. So just a couple things like that that I think we want to be able to do would be good. Yeah, great. Okay, so that's all fine. let's take a look at what I would need to do. You know what I feel like would be kind of nice. Just I'm just throwing this out there. You know what would be kind of nice is if there was a way to view like per frame stuff in like stacks per frame as well, like a something that was just designed to show us a more I want some way of seeing bars over time. Just hear me out on this. Just let me sort of throw this out there. This may be really stupid, and I apologize if it is. But I'm just gonna try. I just want to try something here as a different view type as well. So in draw profile in. So here's draw profile bars, right? And this thing is the thing that goes through and does the the bar horizontal bar. I'm kind of interested to see like what if we did a slightly different thing that was like draw frame bars or something. And this one was designed to kind of go through like a bunch of like all the frame data that we have maybe, and it draws like the bars over time. I don't know, something like this. So we could do something where we go, yeah, like basically the same thing here. I'm gonna start with this, then I'm gonna change it up a little bit. So we come through here, and when we loop through these stored events, instead of just doing one frame, and I guess the problem is when this passes the node, that's not really what I want either, because I want to do one for each of these. Trying to think of how I want to do this. So what I'm trying to say is, here when we call draw profile in, we're passing like a particular event, and that event is, we have many frames worth of data for that event, right? Meaning we could have, instead of picking the most recent frame, we could have picked many frames backwards in time. And so I'm interested to see a version that doesn't work that way. Like, what if, I'm just trying to think of like, what if we did something that was more like draw, we'll do draw frame bars here. And what this does is when we call draw frame bars, we pass it like a debug stored event or something that's like first event, maybe. And maybe like how many events we want to draw, I don't know. And then when we go through it, we loop through the stored events profile node, we loop through like multiple frames of that and draw them all, right? So something like, let's see, something like, we wouldn't have a lane count at the moment. So we would just do like draw profile bars. We'd just do this. And so for each of these, we would go through all of the children just once. We would not do it recursively. So like I wouldn't do this call. But I would also right here do the root event. I would keep chasing the next pointer of the root event to go from frame to frame. You know? And I'd probably do something here like ask how many frames to draw. You know? So let's see. And maybe we default to saying, oh, we're going to draw like 128 frames or something like that. I don't know. So if we were going to do something like that, then we'd say, okay, like the total space that each one of these bars takes up, right? Like the bar width should be the frame count, like whatever the dimension is of our profile rect, it should be the width of that. divided by the frame count. And obviously, if the frame count is not greater than 0, then we wouldn't be able to draw anything because there's nothing to draw. So once we knew that, and then we come through here, then I would probably do roughly the same thing in here, only instead of doing the bars the way we did them up here, I'd kind of do them the other way round. And I probably want this color table to be outside, I suppose. So this is probably something like, global variable, color table, debug color table. So we do something that's essentially the same as this, right? And instead of drawing things horizontally, we just draw them vertically. So I'd still take my cue here where we'd say, okay, we've got the root node, and I'm going to get all the information about that. In order to get that, I have to do this, basically. Let's see here. Yeah. So I get the root node out of the event that we're on. I compute the span stuff exactly the way that I used to. Only instead of using the width now, I use the height. And now when I draw these things, instead of doing the max x, min x, max x for where the profile stuff goes, this would actually be y. But everything else would be essentially the same, right? Yeah. And then that's it. So, all right, so that's it. That's all I'm really saying. And then when we go to create the actual region rect, what we would do is say, well, I know what the bar width is. And so for each of these events, we would move it forwards. So I'd kind of have like a start x or an at x. And I would say that whatever the profile rectangle that we were in, I would want to start at its minimum. And then each time through this loop, I'm going to advance by 1 bar width. So I'm moving over by one of those bar widths. And then inside here, when I draw, excuse me, when I draw these, what I'm going to do is say, well, okay, I need to draw the bar starting at this min y, and I need to draw it from at x to at x plus the bar width. And then I need to stop it at this max y. So now we've just sort of converted to drawing multiple frames in stacked vertical bars, right? And I'm no longer going to allow lanes at all. So what I'd probably do is say that everything has to be in the same lane as the first event, which would automatically be true if that event actually existed, right? Is that true? Yeah. So essentially, you have to have the first event. You have to kind of like have that selected, because otherwise you'd have multiple threads all in there, and I want to only do one particular thread, right? So I'm going to do something here like say, well, for any given profile node that I come through here, I only am interested in ones whose lane index is going to be the same as the one that is sort of the parent, right? So if the node thread ordinal equals the root node's thread ordinal, then I'll proceed. But otherwise, I don't want that in here at all. Now, normally that would just automatically be the case, but I'm just making sure that if you happen to pass down that root one for the frame, it'll only draw like the first thread ordinal or something like this, or none, as the case may be. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe that's dumb. Maybe I'll just leave it? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure what to do there. Basically, the lane stuff is just not relevant because we don't have room to draw it now. And so I'm not sure. I was trying to figure out like what I should do about that. I'm not 100% sure. That's the problem with threads. I think you probably want just stacks for each thread. Is probably what you would want to do in that case, which is a little tricky. So maybe we'll take a look at how we might do that as well. Okay. That is true. All right, so yeah. So now if I run this, we shouldn't see any difference because we're still calling the old one, and the old one should still work fine, right? And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try calling the draw frame bars instead. So yeah, so instead of this, I'm going to try here. Oops. Okay. All right. And the problem that we'll have is at first we're not set to anything in particular. So this will actually give us a root node that's actually the frames root node. And that's a little bit of a problem, right? Because that does have multiple threads inside it. But like I said, we're still drawing those, so I guess the problem is just that they'll draw on top of each other. You know what I mean? And that's not great. Oh. Apparently we drew so many things somehow. I must be drawing too much stuff. What did I do here? Sort event, first child, next to same parent. So we're going through each of these. We're drawing each of its children. Is that really too much? Of course, I should also do, I need to make the frame index be actually capped here. Frame index, listed frame count, and root event. Actually, I suppose I can put that in the same place. Yeah. So we want to make sure the root event actually exists. We would like to be able to keep the frame index as well, and make sure that it's whatever it is. Now I'm going to, for ease of debugging, I'll just make it so that right now, let's say it only draws one. So now we should have absolutely no problem with that. And hey, look, it is an actual stack. So that's good. I'm now going to go ahead and change that up to 10 just to see what happens. And so, yeah, that's not correct. So I messed up something. Because what we should be seeing, we shouldn't be seeing depth. We should be seeing multiple copies of what look essentially like this. And you know what? I guess the other problem is we're not passing it the right kind of event either. We need to be passing it like the first one of something. Right? So really in here, draw frame bars, we want to be passing it instead of the root node. We actually want to be passing it, you know, this where we do this search here. We actually don't want to pass that. We just want to pass it the oldest event. Like we want to pass it way back when, you know, the something it can loop through and draw more frames of. So I guess I'd have to do this essentially. Something like, to kind of hack this together. I need to pass it something like, here's the oldest frame, and I'm just going to grab out of that the root profile node. And but that's not chained together. So frustrating. It's like almost right, but we just don't quite have it correct. Like the frames themselves should have been, if we had made the frames themselves events, then you could just use them directly and it would have worked, which seems like better than what I ended up with. Like these nodes are synthetic and not chained together, so now they can't be used in that way. And that's super lame, right? Let's see here. So I think we want to kind of push on that a little bit just to clean that up. So yeah, so here we are in this part of the code where we get the viewing element and stuff. So if instead of doing this search, I just left it be, so, you know, I could do this essentially. Say we get the viewing element, and once we get the viewing element, then we set the root node equal to the viewing element oldest event. Now what should happen is, normally when we look at it, we just look like this. If we then go to take a particular one of these, right, I don't know which one, maybe like debug collation, then, yeah, and then you can see it looks correct. Well, correct is a strong word here. But it'll draw, a series of these over time where we can see on each subsequent frame how much time each of them took, right? And so we can kind of see like frame to frame. And once this space remaining gets down to 0, they would scroll across too. I can also go in here and say, oh, hey, let's look at a few more of these. So let's say I want like 128 of these bars. And then you can kind of see, like again, a more sort of granular view of like what's happening over time. So I'd like to kind of support that. I feel like we're just a little bit off from how this should work. And I feel like maybe part of that is just the whole, like, I do think we may want to do, instead of chaining those things together and freeing them dynamically like we were, I think we want to do something more like we just allocate a block of, however many frames of backstore we're going to keep, which is like, 128 frames or something like this, or 256 frames, and we just keep that many stored events. And that way we can always just like know that we don't have to deal with the chaining right in that way. And that would just be for a debug element, per debug element. Yeah. In fact, really, now that I think about it, it's just kind of an index anyway, because you still can have multiple events on a single frame for a given one of these, right? There could be like lots of instances where it occurred on that frame. So really, you just need a central table at the top that's like, for this debug element, here's like the 128 times that 128 frames or something like that, and the pointer into the first event that happened on that frame for this element, right? That way you could always quickly scrub around on them and always know I'm trying to draw a particular frame. Give me the set for that frame. You know what I mean? And that seems maybe like what the right thing should be. You still want the chaining. Like the chaining still makes sense. It's just you want the frame index to be there as well. Yeah. I think that's true. And the other thing that I'm wondering too is when we pass down a stored event here, I'm wondering about that a little bit too. So let's take a look at this. So when we're drawing the frame bars, here's us iterating over the frame indices, right? And what we would probably want to do here is make it so that as we, I guess as we go, maybe they would it would just kind of sweep around. So, you know, however many frames that we stored, we would go on that, whatever that element was, and we'd just go through all of the frames that it held. I kind of want to play with this, so I think that's what I'm going to try doing here. So inside the debug element, you can see that right now it's got this sort of head and tail pointer for like each of the events. And that's all the events that happened forever in time. You know what I'm saying? And if we go up to like debug frames and we look at frames themselves, which are here, frames essentially, well, that's not right. I don't even know what this is. Why is this even here? This is going away. It's not even used anymore. And max seasons for frame isn't a thing. None of that's a thing. Yeah. So what I was going to say was for a given frame, right? We've got these root profile node things, and I don't even know, like, if we just kind of look at the way this works. The frame itself doesn't really let us get to the information that we want. It's really like we want to just have a frame index, and then from we don't want to have to search this tree basically to find individual actors. So what we want to be able to do is say, okay, we've got a frame index and a debug element. The debug element's the thing we're trying to inspect. Let's jump right to the elements, the stored events that were for this element on this frame. That's kind of how we actually want it to work. You know what I'm saying? And so that's really the part that I'm concerned about. Now, what I don't super remember is exactly how, when we free these, how do we loop through? Like, do we have a way to loop through 100% of those? I'm not sure how. Yeah, we just go through the entire hash and we free individual element events. So that can still work. So there's really not much that has to happen here, to be honest. Really all we need to introduce is something here that would be called, you know, debug element frame. And the debug element frame would just, you know, it would just keep this stuff. Like so. And similarly, this would be kind of nice for us as well, because inside this, we could keep how much time it took on this particular frame. Right? So we could kind of say, for this frame, you know, what's the total clocks, right? In all these events. So when we run over the events and do the bookkeeping, we can say, oh, this element on this frame took this much time. That would give us a good way to show what our top taking elements were as well, which is another thing that I think would be nice. So then in here, we would just say, however many frames of backstore we have, we're just going to take, you know, I think we just want this to be a straight up array. And then we can do the exact same thing instead of having this stuff have a next and all that. We would do the exact same thing with the frame table here. So where we've got before, where we have a thing where we're like, okay, here's the, you know, here's the first frame, oldest frame, most recent frame. We would just have debug frame, you know, frames. Like so. And so I think it would just be, yeah, okay. So we have these frames. This is how many there are. We do the collation. I don't think we would ever actually need to maintain a free list of them, because that would never actually occur, right? So if you take a look at how this was being managed before, we had a free list for our frames here where we were doing, you know, next and freeze and stuff. We could actually delete all that and say, you know, we always just have this many. And however much the debug frame count is, that's how many frames of back data we store. And that's it. I don't know, 256, let's say. So that's how much back data gets stored no matter what. And then off we go. So I think that's really all we would need in terms of structural changes, is just having the frames now work in that fashion. And the only slightly tricky thing about it is now getting the frame out that we're on. There's the concept of like the total frame index, and then there's also like the frame ordinal, which is just something that's going to wrap around, right? And so then instead of this frame count, we would just have a like, you know, frame ordinal, which is like, next free frame or something like that. And it would start out at 0, so we'd say, oh, okay, you know, the next time we go to retire a frame, we would put it in frame 0, and then we'd increment it. And when it gets to the end, it would sort of wrap around. And so if you wanted to know, what the previous frame was, you would need to look one behind next free frame, if that makes sense. So let's see. Let me see how bad it would be for us to try to clean up the system to work that way. So let's see. So if we're drawing things like in here where we're doing debug draw element, what we would want to know pretty much always is we'd want to have a notion of what frame we were actually drawing, right? So when we come down through something like debug draw element, we would need to know, in addition, when we're coming through, maybe the layout itself could track that piece of information for us. Or maybe that's stored in the debug state. So maybe the debug state kind of has that piece of information. I'm not sure how we want to do that. Since debug draw element's something that's probably called as, sort of a utility, I think we would want to do something here like what is the frame index that we're looking for, or the frame ordinal. And that's the index into that array. So then what we would say is, well, okay, whatever the event is that whatever the thing is that we're going to draw, we would look inside the frame array, and we would get out the most recent event from the frame array. And that's it. So yeah. What this part is doing now is, well, this part is what we were working on before. So I'm going to skip over that for just a second. And let's go down here. Okay. So now in this code where we're sort of going through and drawing this debug tree, I'm going to say that for debug draw main menu, I'm going to say for now, we'll just say that the frame ordinal that we're using is going to be the debug state, like, whatever that current ordinal is. So whatever the one that's next free, we don't want to draw that because that's the one we're replacing. The most recent frame is going to be the one behind that one, right? So what we're going to want to do is say, go one backwards and then clip to the debug frame count. That's going to be that next frame. And we'll clean this up a little bit in a second after I sort of make sure everything's working okay with sort of where we're going to get that information from, because I think this will, once we do this change, we'll also be able to introduce like maybe a little scrub bar that can scrub back, sort of a little time scrubber that would allow us to kind of go back to previous frames back and see what's going on, right? So yeah, so this is going to draw via the frame ordinal. When we're interacting with things, here's our interaction. I assume we're always, when we're, you know what, and let's just do this even right now to make sure that we don't have to keep typing it all over the place. In addition to next free frame, we'll just do most recent frame ordinal here. which is basically the same thing, but we'll just make sure we keep it updated so that people can reference it when they care. So really this is just going to be frames, debug state, most recent frame ordinal. And I guess we could also do this. Oops. And that is that. And it's the same thing in here, right? So this is also debug state, most recent frame ordinal. And there we go. And this is when we're interacting. So again, exactly the same. I don't remember what I called it. I think I called it ordinal. Interaction element, frames. All right. And it's true, the most recent frame, all of these will be fixed in a second. So let's see, oldest event. So this is the freeing code. So in the freeing code, we can basically keep this the same, although the freeing code could be made a little bit simpler now. But yeah, so what we would do here when we loop over these elements, when we're going to free an event, we wouldn't really do it quite the way that we're doing it here. Instead, what we do is say, well, while the we would want to go to whatever the next free frame was, whatever the frame is that we're freeing, we would want to sort of free the entire set of stuff in that element under that frame's ordinal. So instead of doing it this way, we would pass the frame ordinal here. We would then say, like, okay, if we're going to free that, we don't need to free this stuff at all, right? We do, in fact, don't even need a free list for frames anymore, which is nice. That just eliminates some code for us. Like, that's just gone. And instead, all we need to do is say, all right, when we free the frame, we go through here, and for each element, we just eliminate all of the things that were in there. So essentially, while element frames frame ordinal oldest event is equal to something, like while there's anything in there, we're basically going to remove that element, right? So we're going to say this guy's the guy to free. It will then move across. I should probably figure out, I guess, debug element frame. Should probably do this, right? So when I say element frame oldest event, we're going to go ahead and free it and move that pointer forwards. And I don't think we really care about this part at all, because this whole thing is getting eliminated, if that makes sense. So none of this matters anymore. So the only thing that we really need to do is make sure that that one gets put on the deallocation list. So that flushes out that whole thing, and that's it. So now when we call free oldest frame, which we're going to have to change the criteria for, but when we call free oldest frame, what we would do is, instead of doing this at all, what we want to do is simply take that next free frame because next free frame, in fact, really we don't really need this function. Free oldest frame is probably not necessary, because free oldest frame, like all this stuff where it's got next point and stuff, we don't have to deal with any of that anymore. That's just done. So really all that has to happen is we just have to call free frame on the slot that we're going to put stuff into. And when we call new frame, whenever we call that, that's actually making a new frame is really just taking the collation frame, putting it into wherever the slot is that is the next frame we should place in our array, in this array here, right? So we're just writing through that. It's like a circular buffer of frames. So we never like allocate a new frame. All we're doing instead is just freeing the old frame that was in that slot and replacing it with a new one. And so new frame is really the wrong phrase here. It'd just be called init frame would really be it. And whenever we were calling that, we would need a way of saying, I want to replace what's in a slot. So we just kind of have to, do that. That's really it. So I'm going to change this to be init frame. And that's going to not do any of this stuff anymore. This is all gone, right? This is all not a thing anymore. All we really need is this. And it's going to take whatever the debug frame is that it should initialize. And this is it. It's going to initialize it like this. So then I'm going to take a look at what we actually call that does that. Doesn't actually need to return anything there. And this code, I suppose I should just nuke for a minute. So when we go to store an event, we're just going to have to assert on this for the moment. So we're just going to have to say, like, invalid code path here. So like if we run out of memory now, there's not a whole lot we could do. Well, you know what? I suppose that's not true. We could start freeing old frames if we run out of memory. We could free old frames faster than we otherwise would have had to. So I suppose that's fine. So maybe I should think about that a little bit more. So if I did do that, right, then we would just say, well, okay, you know, there's the next free frame and the most recent frame ordinal. I can actually advance these two things separately if that was what I wanted to do. So when I store event, if there isn't room, I suppose I can just do, you know, reintroduce this function. And instead of it moving a free list around, all it will do is just advance that, that thing forward, right? So I'll give it a shot. Yeah. And in fact, I guess it's really just, we don't even really need to write that. It's just whatever the next free frame was, it's just going to free that and advance it. In fact, I could even just do it like this. Because that's all it's doing. It's just going to say, all right, move the free frame pointer forwards, and off you go. And I suppose also this needs to be wrapped, right? Meaning debug state next free frame needs to be wrapped to the debug frame count. Yeah. Okay, so now what's going on? I'm not entirely sure. Frame index equals debug state collation frame index. That actually doesn't seem bad. What's the problem with that? Ah, just that. So all of these really are going to be dots, which is fine. And then the element, whatever the element was, is going to have to use the frame ordinal that we're trying to store. right? And so I suppose the collation frame has to actually be a slot. So really this ends up being U32 collating frame ordinal. So here is the frame we're collating. Here is the most recent frame, which is the one that we finished collating. And then here is the one that's actually free, which I suppose... I guess this is actually the oldest frame ordinal. So all of these would start out at 0. And most recent frame ordinal and oldest frame ordinal would actually be probably 0, and then collating frame ordinal will start out as 1, if that makes sense. And then we would need to move these things forward, right? So anytime we went to store an event, we might have to make room. So yeah. So I'll make this a thing. Free oldest frame. There we go. There's the debug state. And in here, so we'd free this frame. It would go away. And that would be fine. We want to make sure that we're never freeing the collating frame. If that was the case, then we've catastrophically run out of memory. We wouldn't even have enough memory to store one frame. And that seems like just a bug. Like, you don't really ever want that, I don't think. There we go. So I'll make sure the oldest frame is not equal to the collating frame. Right? Collation frame ordinal. So if the collation frame ordinal, if those aren't equal, then we can move it forwards just fine. And what I'd also like to do is say, well, okay, after we free that, I'd like to check out if the collation frame, if the oldest frame ordinal happens to be equal to the most recent frame ordinal. Then I need to increment the most recent frame ordinal as well, because it just got deleted. In either case, I have to do the oldest frame ordinal. And then we just need them to be modded. And what I could do is like increment frame ordinal, so that that's always going to happen. So essentially, there's just like no matter what we're doing, it's going to be like ordinal is going to be incremented, or I guess I could do equals ordinal plus 1 mod max or debug frame count. That seems fair, I think. So yeah, so this is going to be most recent frame. And these have to be addresses. Collation frame. So whatever this frame index is going to be, it's just the collation frame ordinal. Right? Unless we're trying to store the absolute frame index there. I guess technically we are. Probably. So this would actually be that. Not that anyone cares. Anyway, and I suppose we could do this as well. just so it's easy to get what that is. Let's see here. So this right here and there's two different ways I could do this. I could just leave it the same as it is now. And I'm not sure how I want to do that. Right? Because the other thing I could do is just make it so that every time we increment that, we also update a pointer in there which points to the correct one. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I'm going to do it this way for now, but maybe that's a bad idea. All right. So let's see. So now that we actually know which frame ordinal we're on for the collating frame, we can just do a thing where we treat this, and I guess we can just say debug element frame frame equals element frames plus whatever the current debug collation ordinal is. And then we would just say frame most recent event, frame, 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 like so. Yeah. What else though? Let's see here. So get element from event. That's initializing this for a particular element. And I feel like that's just going to have to clear out all of those frames, unfortunately, on the first time through. So what I might do is, we have, when we do a push struct, we can clear, right? So I think I might just appeal to that. Here on push struct, we can do... I guess we clear to 0 by default, right? The default arena params are to clear. So actually, this is just redundant. That doesn't actually need to happen at all. So inside our collation stuff, this is not super necessary at the moment, actually, because that's always going to be set to something. At init time, we'll have to set it, and then it'll always have to be valid. So this doesn't actually need to occur at all. And that's fine. Neither does this. So what we would want to do here is at the frame marker, where do we actually move this guy forward? Not till the very end. Basically, we move it forwards right here. So that's fine. All right, so we don't need this. And I assume we can just sort of say debug frame, collation frame, equals, get collation frame, debug state. And then all of this code can be a little bit nicer, right? You could just say like, okay, let's make sure all of these are accessing off of that, so they don't have to keep going through debug state for no reason at all. Frame bar scale, I don't care about any of this. This is not relevant. We do that in the profile stuff now. I don't think this is necessarily the appropriate place for pause, actually. So I'm pretty sure that that is going to go away. let's go through here. This stuff doesn't need to happen anymore. This does, because that's sort of how many frames total there's been, right? Although there was something about like total frame count and frame count, and we just want total frame count, I think. So that's really it. That's actually much nicer now. That's actually much simpler. And then when we do this stuff, we have to do a frame advance, right? So we have to now do an init frame on the new collation frame. So basically what we have to do is say collation frame equals get collation frame. And then we would need to do an init frame on that collation frame. And right here, before we did that, we'd have to move the frame, move the marker forwards for the collation frame. And if that collation frame were to hit the oldest frame ordinal, we would need to delete the oldest frame ordinal. So what we need to do is say, like, increment the frame ordinal for whatever the frame is that we're collating at the moment, right? We would also want to say that the debug state most recent frame is now this one, because we just finished collating it, right? So it's done collating, and it's now the most recent one. And then finally, we would need to say if we now ran up against, so if our collation frame ordinal is now equal to whatever the oldest frame ordinal was, we need to delete the oldest frame and move that forward to make room, because we're about to start writing into it. If that makes sense. Now, the only problem is I kind of did that in the wrong order, in the sense I don't really want to increment yet. I want to increment after. So what I kind of wanted to say is I want to do the wrapped version of this thing. I mean, you can kind of see what the problem is. It's that our assertion's going to fire. I'll show you what I mean. This is going to fire because it's exactly what happened, right? And I'm tempted to just get rid of it and say the heck with it, so that it's called. I like that calling it that way a little bit better, but we'll see. That might come back to bite me. All right, so here's our collate debug records again. Now we have to deal with just this part here where we're not doing a frame marker. This is, again, also pretty trivial. I think we just grab it out, and then wherever we were going to use collation frame, we can now just get rid of the debug, the part with the debug state. In fact, I could probably just do debug state collation frame becomes collation frame, like so. No! Did that just undo them all? I hope not. Maybe it didn't. I don't know what it did. I don't care. Anyway. So let's see. Debug state frame count. Oh, I did it backwards. I did it backwards. I did the replace backwards because I'm stupid. That's what actually happened. Yeah, let's try that again. What I wanted was debug state collation frame just becomes collation frame. That's what I wanted. I just did it backwards. Okay. Okay. Much better. So now we still have this frame count situation. I don't really know what this frame index is supposed to do. To be really honest with you. But I think it should just be total frame count. And let's see what else we've got. This is all nonsense, and we don't care about any of it. So what we actually want to do now is we want to initialize this stuff the way that I said that we wanted to. So we've got these ordinals, and they should be set up properly. So what we want to do is say that the most recent frame is 0. The collation frame is actually going to be frame 1, and the oldest frame ordinal is going to be frame 0. I think that's what I want. This is now irrelevant. The if statement doesn't have to happen anymore because we always have a frame we can look at. So what I could do is say, well, there is a debug frame that's the most recent frame if that's what you want. That frame is just going to be the debug state frames array plus the debug state most recent frame ordinal. And you can go ahead and print that to your heart's content. I don't know why the indentation in forcoder gets so confused sometimes. It doesn't seem to know about like how to close the parentheses or something. I need to get back to Alan on a couple things. It's my fault actually that I have not. I've been backed up on communiques. I owe him some email. But that's it. I mean, that's all this has to do. So we can just get rid of this. Right. Yeah. Now, I feel like there's some things we are probably still forgetting, so I doubt this is going to work. But at least we got most of it done, and that's fine. Of course, famous last words, it actually did sort of work. This we obviously if-zeroed out. Is this all working? You gotta be kidding me. Okay. Well, I guess that worked somehow. Let's see what happens when we peg the frame size stuff. Let's see if we crash and burn. Yeah. I was gonna say, I would be surprised we didn't crash and burn. So where did we crash and burn at? Exactly. Of course, that might just be some stupidity with this, which is probably true. So we've gone through a bunch of frames. The most recent frame is 252. The collation frame is 137. The oldest frame is also 252. That doesn't make any sense at all. Nope. Does not make any sense. And then they just both keep incrementing up, huh? Yeah, so that's complete nonsense. Just in case anyone was wondering, I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint there. And I want to see what this is set to now. So we let it run. We've gotten to frame 255, which is what we would expect. We're collating on frame 0, and that was the oldest frame, so now we have to advance it. So I just want to see what happens. We go into free frame. Free frame's going to come through here and find any elements that are on frame 0, which is what I would want it to do. Here it's got some. Let's see if there are any events there. There are no events on frame 0, apparently. So it doesn't actually have anything to free. Does it ever get in here? It doesn't. So it can't actually free anything here because there's nothing actually on frame 0, which is actually correct. Frame 0 would be empty because frame 1 was the first frame we ever used for collating. So we look at these two and we see if they are the same, which they should not be, right? So we don't have to increment the most recent frame. We do have to increment the oldest frame, so we do, and that's good. And off we go. And that seems right. So every frame now we should have to do this. This should actually now free some things. So when I come into free frame, this should actually just should trigger, and it does. So let's pull that off. Got free event. We're going to deallocate it. We loop through here and deallocate a bunch of stuff. That's good. Good. So that's all pretty nice, I think. That all seems reasonable to me. And then we're left with the collation frame is on 1. The oldest frame is also on 1, so it moves up to 2. And we're good. Right? So that seems pretty good. So I'm not sure where our bug is. I guess our bug is what happens when you are not freeing through that path. I guess our bug happens when we start hitting the system more heavily when we launch the game part of the game, and we free out of store event. So freeing out of here is obviously, like, this is obviously a problem when we do free oldest frame. So I'm going to see what happens when we get there. Obviously it won't happen here. Well, it would happen here eventually, maybe. It might not, because eventually this will probably count down. You know, that's a little suspicious. So actually, no, I take it back. There's some bug here. We're not actually freeing all of the memory that we allocate on a given frame, because this would stop counting down, basically, when we got to once we got to the 256th frame, because we'd free 1 frame's worth of data and add 1 frame's worth of data, and there's not appreciably more data happening each frame. So we actually still have a bug. So something that we allocate is not getting freed. But the question is, what is it? So here we are on free frame. We're looking through this particular ordinal, which is the one we want to free. We're taking a look at oldest event, which would have all of the stuff that we allocated, right? Because that's where store frame pulls this data from. That sure looks like it should work. Although, I do have one question. What exactly is going on here? You know what I'm saying to you? Why is that? Do we even know why that's a pointer? Because I don't. I feel like that should be baked into the frame. But either way, it sure isn't getting freed. And we would need to definitely free it. I'm going to see what happens if we just do that. You think? Well, all right. When we do free frame, we look at frame ordinal. We'll go in here and say element frame, not element frame, debug frame equals debug state frames plus frame ordinal if frame root profile node free list deallocate frame root profile node. You know what I'm saying? still chewing through the memory there. So I kind of want to know where that's coming from. It's not going to be there. Of course, I'm way over time here. I'm like 10 minutes over time. You know how I get sometimes. You know how I get. What's the problem? There we go. So I am curious, if this is not freeing everything, what isn't it freeing? Is my question. And I suppose we should probably look to see let's take a look. So we've got debug trees, but those are fine. Right, we've got debug views. Those are actually also not part of the collation process. We have debug threads. Now that, in theory, should be being handled separately properly. And that's also part of the debug arena, not the per frame arena. In fact, I can just look at the collation arena, right? Store event. Per frame arena. So we only really need to look at what's coming out of the per frame arena. And so we're literally, this is the only place that we take out of that arena. That's it. Okay? And so if that's the only place is store event, then that means that we are somehow storing events that we are never recovering when we try to do our free event walk. So I definitely messed this part up right here. When we go through the hash and we try to pull out whatever the frame is that we're going to free, for whatever reason, this is no longer an accurate way, I guess, of recovering all those events. But I'm just not sure why. The free event is the oldest event in the frame. We then set the oldest event to be whatever came after that, and we deallocate that one that we were on. That should move all of them from that frame out. And we do that for everything in the hash. What else does that have in it? Dare I ask? I should probably clear these as well. Like after this frame is done, I should probably do a zero struct, right? But that shouldn't have anything to do with it. So I don't know. This may have to wait till tomorrow. I'm not immediately seeing the answer. And we may just have to take a closer look. Basically what happens, it looks like, is we're actually leaking that memory. So before we were properly freeing it, and then I busted it. And so now, instead of being able to always free it when we're done, we're leaking it instead. if that makes sense. So down, down, down it goes, which it should not be. At this point, it should not actually be going down. And then eventually, when it gets to the end, it will hang, presumably, like so. Because now it can't free. It's trying desperately to try to free memory so that it can allocate the next event to store, but it already believes it's freed everything that it could free. So it's just hunting through the circular buffer forever, and it will never find anything more to free because it already thinks it freed everything. So that's just really perplexing. All right. I think we'll have to do a little bit more debugging tomorrow. I'm going to call it for here. Enemy mouse, do you need to wrap that plus frame ordinal in the free frame function? Wrap. Well, there's only two of them. There's this one, and there's this one. But what do you mean by wrapping them? We don't need to mod them if that's right, because this is always inside that range, because they're pre-wrapped. Like when you're saying free it, you're passing an ordinal in, which is already wrapped. I could assert that, right? Like, we probably should. Like, right? We should probably just say here, like, hey, by the way, if you thought you were going to free something that was, like, outside of the frame range, presumably, you know, we would get bogus values and know pretty quickly, but, you know, but no one's ever going to pass that in. So also, I suppose the other thing that, yeah, that's weird. There must be something very simple but subtle that I'm forgetting, because it would seem. Let me see what store event does. Frames plus collation frame ordinal. We know how many events were on that frame. So the other thing that's kind of interesting is I can assert catch this, presumably, meaning I should be able to say, you know, freed event count. And every time we move something to the free list, we could count it, like so. And then when we come down here and we look at what the frame is, we can assert that the stored event count for that frame equals the freed event count, because then we would know, right? If that makes sense. Now this, I suppose we also would have to count. That is madness. Okay, there we go. I was like, I guess I just hadn't gotten to 256 frames yet. I'm like, they shouldn't add up. And they don't. We stored 56. We freed 57. Okay. That makes even less sense. This is the only place we can get one of those. How is that possible? Where is the root profile node allocated, by the way? Store event, element, null event. So it's definitely storing it on the frame. What's the element? So it is wrapped in an element. So that one I didn't actually, so that doesn't actually have to be stored. So that's not actually, I didn't actually need to store it. It is stored under an element. So this doesn't actually have to happen. All right, so if I rebuild that and I run it, now we should get an assertion that when they differ, which if they don't ever differ, that's what I would have expected to see before. Let's see if that happens again. So it was literally just that I was double freeing that, but we had the bug before I did that. That does not make any sense. I mean, it makes sense why that was broken, because we're moving something into the free list a second time, which you can't do, obviously, because it breaks the free list. But how on earth was it not working originally? That's just bizarre. Well, never mind. We didn't have a bug, I lied. I made a bug when trying to fix the bug. Let me take a couple cues here. I'm a bit behind on Handmade Hero, but do you typically bypass for something like off-stream coding all the simplified things like rendering a bitmap like how you were doing, draw a bitmap like on episode 39, and go straight to the renderer, but as well as other things like structured assets and the like? So I guess what I would say is, yeah, I don't typically go through stuff that I already know isn't the way to do something. Like, if I know that my final code is not going to be drawing a bitmap, you know, if I know that my final thing's a GPU thing, I'm not going to, like, spend a bunch of time making a software renderer, obviously, right? And so a bunch of those things I show on Handmade Hero because that is what I did over time, meaning the first renderer I wrote, there was no such thing as a GPU in a PC at that time. So the first renderer I wrote was a software renderer, right? In fact, the first several I wrote were software renderers. And only later, once GPU came on, did I start doing that. And I feel like that's an important part of your education in game programming to understand how to write things like a software renderer. Because it means that you will actually understand how a GPU renderer works, whereas you won't understand that if you've never done it yourself. But you wouldn't do that in the course of product if you already know. If you already know how to write a software renderer, you wouldn't write one again, because you don't need it for anything. Like, unless you had some real specific reason to do so. That, not to say that you couldn't have such a reason, but most of the time, probably not. As for other stuff, like on the debug system, I've been legitimately playing around with it. Meaning I did not know exactly how I wanted this to work going into it, and I've kind of like felt my way around to figure out how I wanted it to be structured. And that's because I wanted to show how to make a complex system experimentally. And that I still do all the time. When I'm trying to design something new, I obviously don't have the luxury of having done it before, because that's what makes it new. And so I have to experiment with how to do it. And so, you know, I've never done a debug system that works exactly like this one does, that has exactly the same features. And so I kind of have been exploring to see how that works. And I'm kind of interested in some of the stuff that I've done so far on it. that's somewhat educational. We can re-enable our profile view. I'll do it tomorrow, but that's going to be good. Dude in Basement 1, thoughts on using a static array instead of the lists? Yeah, I just felt like most of the stuff that we're going to want to do is very much like wants to jump to particular frames, and running through the lists every time to get there did not seem like a great idea to me. But you know, maybe it would have been fine. It was starting to get annoying. So I want to be able to do stuff like say, hey, draw like this frame in the previous frame, and I want that to be easy, or this in the previous 5 frames, or draw frame 4 of everybody. I just felt like that would be kind of nicer, so that's the way why I did that. Miblo, Insobot has this to say: inheritance and encapsulation, 2 best inventions of mankind. Oh my god. Insobot is going rogue. That is a horrible thing to say, Insobot. Enemy Mouse, do you prefer to use modulo or masking for circular indexing? Do compilers replace modulos with bitwise, and if the operand is the power of 2? So what I would say about that is, not blowing the nose, but what I would say about that is modulo should be fine most of the time if you're doing stuff like debug code or things that happen rarely. And they allow you to make your array counts be whatever you want, which is oftentimes nice. In a speed scenario where like I really am worried about how fast it's going to be, you may want to do masking. Because masking can be faster since modulo is an integer divide kind of a situation. And it can be a problem. As far as I know, most of the time compilers are smart enough to replace modulo with bitwise and when it is a power of 2, when the size is a power of 2. The thing moduloing is a power of 2. But have I tested that extensively? No. Most of the time, if I care about the speed, I write the mask myself. But you know, I think compilers, are generally smart enough to do that. I don't think you have to babysit that particular thing. Hertamina, are we still doing the marathon stream to count for the Q&A madness? I don't know that I will. I mean, I reserve the right to. Let's put it that way. So as the profile code you had running several weeks ago, what happened to it? Some of the things you had implemented, like the multiple lanes, you disappeared. No, the multiple lanes is still there. In fact, I can show it to you. I guess I would have to. I just said I wasn't going to re-enable this till tomorrow, but I could re-enable it. Let's see, draw frame bars. So this was the profiler we were working on, and bloop. I just need to port this code. So need to figure out how to get specific frames. Hey, guess what? That to do is now done because we have an array. So what we can do now is say, well, most recent frame ordinal equals whatever the debug state most recent frame ordinal is. Then when we come through here and we get our viewing element, assuming that it actually existed, we can access the root node directly. In a variety of ways. So the first thing we would do here is say, well, the viewing element frames oldest event, like so. So if we do viewing element frames most recent frame ordinal, and on the other hand, we could say, well, debug state frames most recent frame ordinal root profile node, like so. That's not spelled right. Debug frame does not have an overloaded operator. Right you are, sir. All right. So here is the current profile code. You can see the multiple lanes here. Here's the 3 lanes. There's just nothing happening in these other threads. If I wanted something to be happening in the threads, we could turn on the software renderer, and presumably... Whoa. That's not good. This looks like a bug I must have introduced recently, because we were running the multiple frame view just the other day. And that's... in draw rectangle? Oh, you know what? That's probably just because, again, we're draw so much in the draw profile in thing that, yeah, we need a way to not draw all the events because there's way too many events when we go to the software renderer. Let me just turn off the recursion for that for the moment. Yeah, we need some way of figuring out how we would, yeah, make that not happen. But anyway, so here's the multi-lane view in action, because now we actually have multiple lanes going. You know, normally when we are running the GPU renderer, there's really nothing for the other cores of the CPU to do right now, because we just don't have enough work per frame. The GPU is doing a lot of that work. But in the software renderer, you can see now do-tiled render work getting called multiple times per thread on lots of threads, right? So there's all that. There's the work that you're looking for, right? Does that answer the question? The Resco, what if you aren't really learning from Handmade Hero? Where I've gone through episodes 1 through 28 about 4 times, and I thought I knew how to do, so I tried to make the simplified Win32 layer to get to the independent layer, and I found that I couldn't do it. The documentation was rough, and I forgot what the things did. What would you say to people who find that they aren't learning? Well, there's 2 things that could be the case. One is you just need to try harder at it, right? The other might be that... it might be a little too soon for Handmade Hero, right? Handmade Hero is not meant for people who have never programmed before. As I said, you know, sort of the outset of the series, it's made for people who know how to program but just don't know how to program games, or game engines, I should say. So it's designed to take somebody who understands how to program and show them how game programming and game engine programming works. So if you are not at the point where you're comfortable doing a lot of programming, you know, Handmade Hero doesn't have enough introductory material in it probably to get you up to speed necessarily. So I would say you need to do a quick self-assessment to figure out whether that's the case. And if that's the case, then you would want to start with more introductory programming materials, introductory C materials or introductory Windows programming materials, just to get you up to the point where you're like, okay, I'm more comfortable with this stuff now. And then you can do Handmade Hero, which tends to only spend a lot of time teaching the game engine parts, not just what's a pointer or stuff like that, which, you know, would be the kinds of things that more introductory material would have. So you kind of need to figure out whether that's a problem as well. And I don't know, like, since I don't know you and where you're at, I couldn't necessarily say which one of those would be the case, right? But yeah. I'm getting pretty excited about getting this profiler good, because it's getting there, and it's gonna be pretty sweet. All right, I don't see any more cues, so I'm gonna call it call it a day. Also, I wonder now if we do this. Yeah. So now, yeah, we're totally set up for tomorrow to go into frame bars, and that'll just draw like all the frames of a particular element that we go to. So I'm pretty happy about that. All right, folks, I'm gonna call it. You know what I should also do? I should start this loading. Is that? Here's another question for you. Where that was in J colon? Where was that at? Blackboard at J work archive. Work archive. Days 100 to 199. Why is it specifically in there? Does that even make any sense to anyone? Like, why is it in there? Shouldn't it be out here? Well, I don't know. You know what? I don't even care. Don't know. Don't care. I'm just going to keep it doing whatever it's doing and let it do that thing. I am going to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with a source code, which you can use to follow along. You can also support us on Patreon if you would like using this button. You can go to our forums using this button and ask questions. You can find out our schedule by going to the tweet bot, which tweets the schedule at you. And if you want to use the editor that we use on the series, it is called 4Coder, and you can find it by putting 4Coder into your favorite browser. And it's this dude right here. It has a Patreon page you can go to. And if you use the $5 a month pledge tier, you can get your very own alpha version of it that's the same as the one that I'm using. That's about it. I will be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, for more profiler fun. I'm kind of excited about fancy profiling, and I tend to be the only person who's ever excited about code, I guess. So I don't necessarily know if you are, but that's the problem with you not being the people in charge of the stream. I get to make all the rules. So, you know, what can I say? More profiling. It's going to be awesome. I will see you guys back here tomorrow for that. Until then, have fun programming, and I'll see you on the internet. Take it easy, everyone.